Difference. Okay, let's see. Testing. We're good? Okay. Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Jazakallah khair for joining us today for our regular Friday program. Today's topic, like the brother mentioned, is regarding youth dawah, right? And regarding sort of dawah in general, right? And the title is Rethinking Youth Dawah, right? And there's a parallel between potential and execution that we want to sort of kind of get into. And as we sort of get into this, I want to make a couple of things clear as we proceed, right? In the sense that this is a huge issue, obviously, as we see in our society, in our communities, our families, the ummah wide. And the purpose of this particular session is sort of to kind of get our mindset ready for this conversation. We may not necessarily solve all the problems here, but the idea is let's sort of understand what's going on. Let's see if we can sort of identify some of the key factors that play here. And obviously, as individuals, as Muslims, as a community, what are certain steps or thinking processes we can employ sort of moving forward. Let me put this on mute. And okay, so to proceed. There is definitely, we have to sort of admit to ourselves as we move forward, there is a sort of crisis in our community. There is sort of a crisis, within our masajid, and really something sort of ummah-wide. And this is something our attention is always on, which is the crisis of the youth, right? And it seems that this crisis is never sort of ending, right? And much of our focus, for those that are like working within the dawah or working within our communities, our masajids, etc., much of our focus rests and is centered around this concept of the youth, right? And the manifestation of this in our everyday life is, we see all the time sort of like Quran classes going on, young children becoming hufad. We see sort of youth programs being run in masajid. There is this intense focus, right? And as we're kind of progressing older, like let's say high school, let's say college, campus organizations, right? Like the MSA, the Muslim Student Association, things like that, become sort of the center of our focus because we recognize, obviously, there is a need. There is something that's going on here that we have to pay very close attention to. And yet, despite that, what we see kind of in front of our eyes, it sort of seems like there is, despite all those efforts and focus and intense sort of, looking at that segment, there seems to be further alienation, isolation, and to a certain degree, dwindling of the youth in our community, in our masajid, and, in a way, ummah-wide as well, right? And we see that there is a phenomenon that's going on that doesn't exactly make sense as we look at it initially. And we have to stop ourselves, right? And ask what exactly is going on here. And we have to try to formulate and understand how to move forward. And this is essentially the conversation we're going to have today. And like I mentioned, if there's any thoughts or comments, you're free, to mention it while we're going. And obviously, we're going to have an inshallah discussion after this kind of opening, right? So for very good reasons, right? There's a lot of intense focus on the youth, right? Because youth represent like a seed, right? They represent almost endless potential. You can take someone that's a youth, you can take someone that's young, and you can mold them, you can change them, you can teach them, they can grow up to become anything, right? Obviously, they can become engineers, doctors, people that can solve complex problems. They have the potential to do anything, right? They have the potential to work for change, and change certain circumstances. And we are an ummah that is in need of a change of circumstances, right? We see what's going on around us, and there's a certain reality that doesn't match what we believe, in our deen, what we believe in our, what is sacred to us, right? So there's this intense focus on the youth, right? But that comes with the trade-off, right? So youth have this ability, this potential that can be tapped into, that can be unlocked, that can be cultivated, but they lack the ability to execute. Some can't drive. They live with their parents. They don't have a source of income. They are under all these constraints, and this hinders obviously their ability to execute, their ability to manifest change. They have potential, but not necessarily the means to manifest change, right? And while we're discussing the youth, right, at the same time, we have to ask ourselves, what exactly happens, right, once these youth grow up, right? So like we said, there's a lot of focus on the youth, right, all the way up to, the higher tiers of their education, in their organizations, in the masajid, etc. But what happens after that fact? How does the dawah change after that fact? What is the reality we're looking at? And if we're honest with ourselves, the reality is that the focus shifts from dawah to survival. I have to get married. I have to find a job. I have to, get kids. I have to provide for them. Okay, now I'm in that cycle, and now what? I have to work on the youth. And the cycle sort of repeats, right? And as we're sort of seeing in front of ourselves. And then, so that brings us to another question, right? So if the focus of, the adults as they grow up become survival, then who exactly is making and working on the change that is so badly needed within our communities, within our families, within our masajid, within this ummah that is going through a intense time of tribulation? And this is really a big part of the youth crisis that, inshallah, I want to sort of talk about today. Is that part which doesn't get as much attention is, what do you do after that point? What do you do after you stop being a youth? And, inshallah, as we kind of get into this, right, I want to refocus our attention to a couple of ayahs of the Quran, right? As we sort of come to an understanding, right? And anytime we have an issue, a conflict, something that doesn't quite seem to be making sense, we obviously refer it back to Allah and His Messenger, right? And His book. And I want to bring our attention today to a couple of ayats from Surah Ma'idah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala narrates to us a intimate conversation between Musa alayhi salam and his people, his qawm, Bani Israel, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala narrates this to us not as a history lesson, but as something for us to reflect on, because the lessons from the previous nations are something that we have to pay attention to and sort of implement, take heed of. So as we get into it, right? Musa alayhi salam, he relates to his people in the translation of the meaning, O my people, enter the blessed land, referring to the land of Al-Quds, which Allah has assigned to you, and do not turn back. And so basically, the people of Musa alayhi salam, the Bani Israel, is promised the Holy Land. This is a promise from Allah right after they are rescued from the clutches of Pharaoh. And they say in response to Musa, O Musa, indeed within it is a people of tyrannical strength, and indeed we will never enter it until they leave. But if they leave it, then we will enter it. And they continue, as this surah continues, they say, O Musa, indeed we will not enter it ever, as long as they are within it. So you go and your Lord, and you fight. Indeed, we are remaining right here. Now, just to kind of contextualize that just a little bit, right? This is right after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rescues Bani Israel from the clutches of Fir'aun. They see with their eyes the miracles that Musa alayhi salam brought. They see with their eyes his hand that turned from a regular hand to one that's glowing. They saw with their eyes the staff of Musa alayhi salam that became a snake and swallowed up the trickery of the magicians of Fir'aun. They saw with their eyes how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala split the sea for them, and they saw with their eyes the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala where He destroyed Fir'aun and his army very, very easily. And after this point, the promise comes to them, the promise of their promised land, and they are told to go to that land, which is currently inhabited by people who do not believe in Allah, and they are told to fight against these people and establish that land. And what is their response? And this is something we need to pay attention to. Their response is that, "Oh Musa, look at these people, they're so strong. Oh Musa, look at these people, they've been here forever. Look at us, we're so weak." They're scared. They fear people more than they fear Allah. And in turn, they turn arrogantly to their Nabi, right? They turn arrogantly to their Prophet and they say, "You and your Lord go and fight. We're going to stay right here." It's completely unbelievable, right? As we kind of look at it in hindsight, right? But why, again, is this brought to our attention? Because it is a lesson that we have to take away from, take it from away and ask those similar questions to ourselves. Today, we also have a mission. Today, we are also entrusted with a mission from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make His deen manifest, to make the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the highest in the land, to make this deen we believe in it and act practically upon it. And we have to ask ourselves the same sort of questions. Are we also scared? Are we also scared of people? Are we also scared of the consequences that may come from standing upon the truth? Are we scared to fight? Are we scared as an ummah, as a community, as individuals to take a stand? If we are, and of course we're human beings, maybe part of us has that in us, and if we are, we need to understand what was the result of those who fear people more than they fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So after Bani Israel, in this narration from Surah Ma'idah, after they refused to act upon the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in turn, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told them to wander aimlessly throughout the land, throughout the forest, throughout the wilderness. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wiped away this whole generation of Bani Israel who refused to believe in Him, who refused to act upon His commands, and who refused to trust His power over the power of other human beings. And this promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right, of the land of Al-Quds was not enacted or not manifested for Bani Israel until it was by the hands that were fought by, Dawud alayhi salam, and Bani Israel at that time, which was actively fighting physically, in order to attain that promise. And it was also built upon the works of the previous people from Bani Israel, right? The general Talut, the various tribes that were united. All of these things were going on. And so the point is that it is not enough to believe. It is not enough to say that we're Muslims if we're not also ready to act upon it, to live upon it. And so let's sort of take this back to this concept of dawah, right? Why did I bring up the story exactly? Because we have to sort of ask ourselves, of course, as Muslims, we're not like Bani Israel exactly, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us with the deen, but we can be just like them if we do not come back to His deen and critically ask ourselves, reflect upon the ayat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, reflect upon our reality, and see how we can make sense of those two, see how we can change our reality to match the revelation. So when we're talking about Dawah, we have to kind of ask ourselves again, is it that we're scared that this whole generation, right, this whole segment of our community, right, past the age of college, there is almost no Dawah that exists, right? The Dawah, in a sense, is fixated on the youth. You know, I have to make sure my children are upon Islam. I have to make sure my community is upon Islam to some degree, right? It's a very individualistic way of looking at the reality, right? And the consequences of that we're seeing before our eyes is that in this sort of defensive Dawah, people are becoming weak in their faith. People are, in ways, leaving Islam. People are allowing these other various ideas, ideologies, ways of thinking to seep in because it's all about defense. It's not necessarily about expansion, right? And if you think about it, right, we talked about that parallel in the beginning, just briefly, about how youth, of course, have this potential to make, to become something great. But as the years go by, the potential decreases, and you have the ability to execute until you reach a point where there's not any further growth really that can happen. Like for an old man, it's very difficult. For example, if you've never learned tajweed, to learn tajweed. For a child, it's very easy. The potential is there, but someone that's a much older man, he has a job, he has potentially wealth, he has connections, he has family, he has more means to manifest certain good deeds that can happen. He has more means to manifest practical work in the Dawah that can happen. So this is a little bit of the balance that I want to sort of bring upon this table as we're having this conversation. And sort of pivoting away from this ayat, I want to share an example from our history, right? So of course we have the ayat, and we also have examples within our history, right? And one example I want to focus on here very briefly is the example of Sultan Fateh, right? And he was the conqueror of Constantinople. And anyone know how old he was when he conquered Constantinople? 21? Okay, yeah, so one brother saying 21. I think it's actually 23, I think, from what I read. But nonetheless, right? So this was a guy that was pretty young. If we sort of contemporize it to our time, it's basically when you're right out of college. Obviously, we can do a little bit of inflation, deflation, right? Because 23 at that time, or 21, that time is kind of maybe closer to 30 today. But in any case, he was young, right? That's a fact. This is something we share proudly, when we're talking about history, when we're talking about look at what we have done. It was Sultan al-Fatih that he acted upon the hadith of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, where he foretold that, part of the hadith which is narrated by Ahmed, that you will open Constantinople. Its emir is the best emir and the best army that an army will be. So this is basically, so Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, right? He has praised the emir who will open Constantinople, and he has praised that army. And for that reason, Muhammad al-Fatih, as we know, he opened Constantinople. Now, that's a lot of what we hear about, but I want to go back to this, right? So what is it that made him do this? How is it that he manifested this change, right? Similar to the changes we are looking for today. How did he, as a youth, execute this? Some of the things we don't hear as much about is that, did you know that his father, the father of Sultan Fateh, also attempted to conquer Constantinople? Did you know that in the Uthmani Khilafah, in the Uthmani Sultanate, there was various attempts? I want to say somewhere in the ballpark of 40 to conquer Constantinople. Did you know that for 800 years, the Muslims, various segments of the Muslim community were competing to conquer Constantinople? All the way from the time of the Sahaba all the way up to when Sultan Fateh did it approximately 800 years later. So the point is, well, a couple of points. I want to make one quick point before we get to the main point, but I want you guys to kind of consider this for 1 second. It's a little bit of an aside, but I think that's okay. We have a little bit of a more cozy group today, but it's just one sentence. It is just one piece of revelation, just one hadith that caused 800 years of an effort to conquer a city. And that was not just any city. Basically, that was like the largest, you could say, like nexus, hub of civilization during that time period in the world, right? So this was basically, one word from the Messenger of Allah, caused basically, the world to change, the world to shake, the walls of Constantinople to be obliterated, to turn to dust, walls that could not be conquered for more than 1,000 years, just one word, right? And there's so much to go in there, right? But that is the power of this deen. It is this deen, when it is manifested, that causes the world to tremble before it. But coming back to this example, I want us to think about exactly how this happened. So we think of Sultan Fateh, right? But he was at the end of this whole journey, right? This was something that started for 800 years. And so the point is that this was a lived reality. This was something that he witnessed growing up. His own father tried tremendously to conquer the city. Of course, at the same time, his father was giving him the best teachers, was giving him the best people to learn under. And he was trying his best to unlock the potential of this little boy who becomes Sultan al-Fateh. But at the same time, he was fighting the fight. At the same time, the biggest, perhaps, source of da'wah for his son was his father himself. Okay, let's just keep that idea in mind and let's move forward. We're going to come back to it, inshallah, but let's just keep it there at the moment. Another little segment of history I want to just talk about briefly, right, is of Salahuddin Ayyubi, right? We know very famously he was the commander that rescued the land of Al-Quds from the Crusades, right? The Crusades that lasted 86 years, it was upon his hands that Al-Quds was finally liberated. But what we don't know as much was that this campaign to fight the Crusaders, this campaign to unite the Muslims, was being lived much before his time. And primarily, what's famously kind of known to us is the example of Nuruddin Zengi, right? Who was the commander that Salahuddin actually reported to, right? It was the commander that was working to unite the various tribes and populace of the Muslims during that time. And it was upon his death that Salahuddin Ayyubi, he took upon those reins. It was upon that legacy, it was upon that dawah that he sort of took the reins. Now, I want to kind of ask you guys a question, right? So let's go back to those examples really briefly, right? Let's take Sultan Fateh for an example. So let's say that Sultan Fateh's father and his father before him, and the Sultan before him, and the Khulafa before him, let's say their focus was, we're not strong enough yet to conquer Constantinople, so I'm going to teach my son how to do this. I'm going to teach the youth how to do this. I am going to build youth that can do this. In your assessment, do you think that Sultan Fateh would have done it? Yeah, go ahead.
I think he would have had the same attitude for his kids, of training his kids. He would think himself, he doesn't have the power to train my kids, and that cycle would keep on going.
Yeah, I think I saw a lot of head shaking, and I think the brother pretty much nailed it. He said most likely, it would seem that he would fall within that line of, okay, I'm not quite there yet, but let me train my children. I'm not quite there yet. Let me train my youth, all right, in order to be able to do this, right? And in a sense, that cycle will keep going, and perhaps nobody would bring that change. Perhaps upon nobody's hands, the promise of Allah would come. And that is essentially what I want us to kind of think about today, right? Is that when we're reflecting upon the dawah, right, we're seeing a lot of we're seeing a lot of realities that make us a bit sad, right? That make us a bit depressed. There's youth that are adopting things that are completely outside Islam. There's youth that are perhaps leaving Islam. There's things like suicide rates are going up. There's things such as the adoption of corrupt beliefs or ideologies or ways of life that are kind of sucking us in. There's kind of youth that are becoming much more, you could say, Americanized. They're leaving Islam for a secular way of life where it's all about my personal belief. It's all about my personal feelings. It's all about my relationship individually with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, perhaps even if it's to a degree. If it's not, how does this make me feel, right? So we're seeing certain realities that are not matching up. And what I want to interject in this conversation is that part of that focus perhaps is because there is a big gap in the dawah in the sense of what happens after you start becoming a youth. What do you do? And the reality that we mentioned before is you end up, okay, I got to get married. Okay, I got to get a job. Okay, I got to provide for my kids. You're stuck in this cycle. Okay, now I have kids. Okay, fine. I will train my kids. Love Islam, love His Messenger, love Allah, love His Messenger, work for this deen. Okay, if you're lucky, let's say your kids understand that. If Allah SWT has blessed you, let's say your kids adopt that. Now what? So here's the cycle I want to talk about a little bit, is that change requires a lived reality, right? And amongst some of the teachers I've had that, and we go into it, they make it very clear, right, that the knowledge gaining, the halakat, the classes, stuff like that, it is perhaps 20%, 10 to 20% of what makes you a capable da'i or dawah carrier or a Muslim or someone who's striving for Islam. The rest of the part, the 80% of it, must be lived. And so that's kind of something I want us to think about as a community, right? Who do people who do Muslims have to look up to after their youth? There's a bit of a desert out there. There's a bit of a confusion. It seems almost as if this potential you have as a youth, right? You have all these things going on, but when you're past that age, let's say 25, let's say 30, let's say 35, let's say 40, automatically you become sort of used goods. You become sort of kind of useless to the dawah. You become sort of, in a sense, ineffective. And this is something that I want us to have a sort of mindset change about, because if we look at, again, we talked about Sultan Fateh, right? We talked about Salahuddin Ayyubi really briefly. Okay, let's talk about Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. If you look up at him, the Nubuwwah started at what age? 40. Much of the earliest Sahaba upon whom the weight of Islam was carried were above the age of 40. They were older. They weren't what we classify, quote unquote, as youth. We had Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, right? Sacrifice his wealth, his family, his time, his even his physical body, ready to sever ties with his own children for the sake of Islam. With his money, he freed the Muslims are being tortured. He used his power that he had to execute, because obviously, right, he wasn't a youth, but he had amassed a certain executable means, right, that could be executed for the sake of Islam, and he used them. And we know him because of that. We know Umar ibn al-Khattab, right? A little bit younger than Abu Bakr, but not a youth necessarily. He was already at the time one of the leadership of Quraysh. He used Hamza radiallahu anhu, upon whom the face that were ridiculing, defiling Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam were stricken. He was older than Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was his uncle. So the point is, Dawah is not just about the youth. Dawah is just not just about those people who are young. Dawah, a lot of it, the weight of it must rest upon those who have the means to carry it. And in Islam, there's no concept of you're an old man, or you're past the prime, or you're expired goods, or whatever it may have be. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you means, right? Perhaps at the age of 80, at the age of 70, at the age of 40, you do not have the potential that someone has at the age of 12, or at the age of 15, or the age of 20. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed you with means that are life and death, means that can make it or break it for the dawah. And just kind of moving a little bit forward, we know that obviously there was a lot of young Sahaba that came that also culminated into great people that we know. Like, I mean, every Sahaba almost is like amazing, but even like Ali ibn Abu Talib and Zubair, all these names that we know so frequently, but part of their upbringing, part of their tarbiyah wasn't necessarily that there was these dawah events, so to speak, or these sessions for the youth only. It's because they were immersed in a struggle that had people of various ages, and particularly people older than them at the front lines, carrying the weight. And they saw it with their own eyes. They saw Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, giving dawah to the people of Quraysh. They saw Abu Bakr, they saw Umar, they saw Uthman, they saw all these people much older, right? These were their teachers, not necessarily because they taught them while sitting down. Of course, that did happen and must happen, but because they saw a lived reality which was etched in their hearts and their minds. And so this is essentially, I want to kind of bring this a little bit to a couple of sort of comments, right, before we open it for more discussion. But I want us to take this as a moment to reflect a little bit and to think about the reality and kind of consider that the dawah that we have as individuals, as a community, as masajids, as organizations, it needs to move beyond just youth retention. Youth retention meaning, I want to make sure my kids are upon Islam. I want to make sure the youth around us are upon Islam. It needs to move away from just doing that to actively, proactively, assertively making the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the highest in this world. And like we sort of mentioned, youth of course have potential, but it is the adults, it is quote unquote in this society that hates death, the old men that have the means for execution. And this means that we have to strive to be a generation deserving of victory, because as we looked at in the example of Bani Israel, it's not enough that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives you a promise. Of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives you a promise, and the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the truth, it's the haqq. But to be deserving of that promise, you have to work for it. And for that promise to be manifested in reality, a whole generation must be working upon it. Not just the youth. A whole generation must be working and striving, and the most productive segments of society, right? Obviously, in the capitalistic system we live in, right? The most productive of your years are considered between ages of like 22 and like 60, right? Your working years, right? Where you can produce, you can work, you can make money, you can enact change. But so is that in Islam. Your means are the same. So these are the years that must be intense for dawah, right? Okay, moving forward. We have to recognize that youth learn from our lived experiences, from our example. That if we want our son to be, Sultan Fateh, of course, based upon the hadith, Constantinople was already conquered, but Rome has not been. And if I want my son to be the conqueror of Rome, well, I gotta be the guy that's actively working upon it, don't you think? If we want to be an ummah of victory, we want our children to be an ummah of victory, we got to be working upon it. And just as another aside, to be honest with you, right, brothers, as we're kind of thinking about this, forget our kids. I want to be the person upon whose hands Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives victory. I want my generation, I want us to be the people upon whose hands Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives victory. Why do I want other people to get that reward, even if that's my kids, even if that's our children? You know what? So this is a mindset that we need to change in a way. We have to consider and think of development of the post-college, post-youth members of our community in terms of knowledge, in terms of dawah, in terms of projects, in terms of using those means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed you with, like money, power, connections, all these blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us the strength to use for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I mean, we work so hard to become experts in like engineering, or become experts in academics, or get straight A's, or become doctors, or businessmen, right? Or climb the corporate ladder, take all the certifications, and it's like Islam after your quote unquote youth becomes an afterthought. And like I mentioned, these are the most productive years of our life, right? The post-youth years, quote unquote, that must be harnessed and used for the sake of Islam. And moving forward, the next point, right? That our dawah, right? The dawah of Islam, it needs to take a proactive and assertive approach and not a reactive and defensive one. Because guess what? If we're going to continue doing that, then we're going to continue to be in a cycle of people leaving Islam. We're going to continue to be a community that's dwindling in the state of constant kufr around us. Because dawah works two ways. Either we're giving dawah or we're receiving dawah, right? Either we are calling people to Islam, and we're calling the society to Islam, and we're calling the world to Islam, and we're calling our Muslim nations to Islam, or we are being called upon another deen, whether that's secularism, capitalism, communism, Americanism, whatever it may be. Either we are giving dawah or we're receiving it. There's no middle ground. So if we want to protect ourselves, the best defense is a good offense, right? And if we want to sincerely protect our kids, we got to become those people in the thick of the fight. And that kind of brings me to the last maybe concluding part of this before we kind of open up, right? Is understanding a little bit of what the objectives of the dawah objective to dawah is, and what is the objective of the dawah to Islam. Is it merely that your kids believe? Is it merely that you believe? Is it merely that your masajid believes? Is it merely that your community believes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? It's not. Because if it was, the mission of Muhammad would be much easier than it was. If it was, he wouldn't be attacked and boycotted by the elites of Quraysh. He would not be stoned by the people of Taif. He would not have had to fight for every single year of his nabuwah, right? The mission of the prophets and our mission is to make the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the highest in the land, highest in the world, and make Islam a practical, living reality in all spheres of life. And that requires work, not just as a youth, and that requires dawah, not just to the youth, but work and dawah to all segments of our society, and most critically, perhaps I would say, to that segment of our society that has the ability to harness the means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them to create practical change. Those productive years, those post-college years, those post-youth years, right? And there's a lot of initiatives and things we can talk about. But inshallah, we'll move forward from there. I think we can kind of close it right here and open up the floor for discussion. This is something, like I mentioned, we're gonna have a lot of talk and development upon. It's not necessarily a solution to everything, but it is something that I wanted to introduce. So we may start thinking a little bit. We may start recognizing that there's a pattern at play that perhaps we need to break out of. And we can proceed to Q&A. Yeah, okay, go ahead.